Good afternoon, everyone. This is Joe Papano from FiberLink Communications. Thanks for joining us on our webinar this afternoon. A couple ground rules first, then we'll jump into things. If you're having trouble hearing, John Harrington's going to send out dial-in instructions so you can join the bridge if you're having trouble streaming. Also, John's going to shoot out via chat a link to get today's slides, so we've already got them posted. But during the webinar, you'll be able to go get them, and a recording of this webinar will be available at the same URL tomorrow. We're going to ask you, John's also going to shoot you out a link now that will send a tweet out about you attending this webinar. So if you're inclined, please do that for us. And as usual, the ground rules are going to be, we're going to go fast. We're going to try to make it 30-35 minutes of material and then leave time for Q&A. We've got a couple polling questions that we'll run during the webinar. We'll share the results with all of you. And with that, I will jump right into things today. So our topic today is best practices for testing mobile apps. So this is the follow-on to the webinar we did a few weeks ago about developing mobile apps for iOS. So obviously, we would certainly recommend if you're going to develop apps, you should probably test them. And I'm really happy and glad that we're able to get Frank Schloendorn, our Director of QA, to put the material together today and present it to you. So you really won't find someone more knowledgeable about how to test apps and specifically how to test mobile apps. And so Frank's got a lot of knowledge about how to test cross-platform. Obviously, we write software for every major platform, including Windows, Mac OS X, BlackBerry, Windows Mobile, iOS, Android. So you've got a great resource here to talk to about how to test apps, what techniques to use, what tools are out there that can help you, and we're hoping that that's valuable to you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank. Frank, thanks for putting all this together today.
No problem, Joe. Good afternoon or morning, everyone. I think we're going to start with a poll question. So basically, we want to get an idea from everyone out there on what your company's current position on testing or certifying mobile applications is. Are you not doing any testing or certification? Are you testing and certifying apps that are developed in-house or maybe by a contract or an outsource firm who does the software development for you? Or do you test and certify applications not only designed internally but ones from third-party vendors too, maybe like email clients or security apps on the marketplace?
So we'll share the results with you in a few seconds on that.
Okay. So while we're waiting for the results, let's talk about what we're going to learn today. There's a few different topics that I want to cover. This is actually a pretty heavy on material as compared to some of the previous webinars that I've attended. But there was a lot of good stuff here I wanted to share with you. So I may go quickly through some of it, but that's really so we can leave some time at the end for questions where we can elaborate on things if people would like to know more. So I'll start out by talking about some of the challenges of testing mobile applications, the importance of knowing the app that you're testing, what types of testing are there that apply to mobile applications, as well as how it compares to traditional desktop/laptop application testing. We'll spend some time talking about tools and resources that can aid you in your testing efforts on the various platforms. And then I'll end it with a list of helpful things, helpful hints or things to remember. This basically comes from the years of mobile device testing that we've been doing here, kind of the gotchas and the things to look out for that we've seen in the past. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to cover.
All right, so you can see the results are in from the poll. So about a third don't test at all. Don't know, Frank, what you'd say about all that. About a little less than half test in-house, and about a third use third parties for testing.
So, great. Okay, we'll go right into the second poll question before we get into the meat of the presentation, which is, despite what you're testing now, what are your plans for future testing? So I assume, since we have a lot of people on this webinar, that you may be planning at some point to do testing, or maybe you're already starting testing. You're trying to kind of, figure out how to approach it. So are you planning to test in-house applications? Are you planning to test outsourced applications or third-party applications from the various app stores or marketplace? Okay, Okay, so we'll get back to you with the results of that poll in a couple minutes as well. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and start up with challenges of testing mobile applications. So one of the things that I find you have to remember when you're testing mobile applications is although there was a lot of similarities to how you test desktop or laptop applications, traditional applications, you also have to realize that there's a lot of differences as well. A lot of people are used to just supporting one major OS or one major vendor OS when it came to desktop applications. We're a Windows house, right? There are some people who may have been Windows and Mac based, but a lot focused primarily on Windows, or maybe you were a Mac house and you focused on Mac. When you're talking about smartphones, the divide is much greater in that most smartphones that are deployed in an enterprise are multiple platforms. Android and iOS, of course, being the big two these days. BlackBerry, as we know, has fallen off some in the recent years, but is still a player in the field. And then you have newcomers like Windows Phone 7, which is steadily climbing. You also have some of the more legacy ones at this point, Windows Mobile, also known as Windows 6X, or Nokia Symbian platform, which is fairly popular over in Europe. We'll also have the introduction of the Windows 8 platform by the end of the year, which will introduce another level or another player to the field from Microsoft. One of the things to remember in addition to that is that updates to third-party apps or mobile are generally much more frequent and harder to control. I've had applications on my Android and iOS devices that 3 days in a row have received an update from the marketplace. So there's good and bad on that. The good news is that it means the developer is fixing the issues, and it's a little quicker and easier to get a package out than it is when it was a traditional desktop application where you got to test installation and upgrades, and those things exist, but generally are able to be tested and deployed quicker. But from a certification standpoint, this can be a nightmare. You got to be careful because you don't know what exactly is being changed in that. And especially if it's a third-party application that's not developed or designed by you, then you don't really have control over how often those updates come. And unless you employ a very strict security policy on blocking people from getting to like the marketplaces to get these applications, you generally don't always have full control of the user's ability to update. You can't guarantee that all the users get the update at the same time. You can't guarantee, that users aren't going out and searching for the upgrade on their own or upgrading before they're ready. There are various tools such as app stores that you can deploy to help push the apps, but unlike desktop / laptop applications where you can use like a platform to push the applications out in the background on a device where the user has no control or doesn't even know what's happening, it just happens when they're online. With smartphones and tablets, there's generally some level of user interaction required. The other big thing I worry about is performance concerns. Yes, we worried about memory and CPU usage with desktop applications, and yes, there are concerns as well with handhelds, but battery is the big culprit when it comes to handheld applications. Does the application use too much of my battery? I have, the law of end-user battery usage suggests that if you make an end-user install an application that they don't want to, they're immediately going to tell you that application is massively draining their battery. We'll talk about that a little later under tips and tricks, but I've seen too many times where you send an application out, it does basically nothing, yet the user still claims his smartphone battery is dying in half the time it used to just because that application's on there. So battery usage is something we hear a lot and that you'll get to as well when it comes to applications. A couple other things to touch on, challenges of testing mobile applications. Fragmentation, this is primarily an Android issue. If you're not familiar with fragmentation, it's the fact that there are so many different OS versions and actual hardware versions of the platform. So for Android, you have about 5 different major versions out there and about 6 more different minor updates. And then all the vendors seem to have their own version, if you will, of the OS as well. So HTC puts their own front end on top of the Android OS. Samsung puts their own. Motorola puts them on. All these things are items that can interfere with your testing and certification of software. Okay? And then, of course, the hardware specs. And, whereas iOS is pretty strict, they have one device each generation that apps run on, so you only have to worry about 3 or 4 combinations at a time at the most. With Android, you can have processors down to 512 megahertz up to dual-core or now quad-core processors, and memory varies, and the features supported by the device varies. So, again, more of an Android concern than iOS or even Windows Phone 7 or some of the other ones at this point, but something you need to be aware of. And finally, there's a very limited number of tools that can help. Okay, so before we move on, do we want to get the results of the last poll we did?
Yeah, we did it a few minutes ago, but we'll go through it real quickly here. So the question was, what type of mobile apps does your company test or plan to test? Obviously, most people are worried about testing in-house apps as opposed to apps they've either outsourced or bought.
Okay, very good. Okay, so in my opinion, one of the first things you need to know before you're going to test a mobile application is know the application itself you're testing. The first thing is, this is an application we're developing in-house, or is it one that's from a third party? And in this case, by third party, I mean something that's in the marketplace. You have no direct ties to this company. It's just an application you saw that does something that your company wants to roll out or utilize. Okay? If you're doing in-house developed apps, you want testing to begin as early as possible. And what I mean is, as soon as development has a working build that can be put on a device or run in a simulator somewhere, you want to start looking at it then. A lot of times developers won't necessarily look for certain things that someone who's testing a device will, such as usability. Developers are generally concerned with functionality and getting it to do what it's supposed to do. Testers are often, left with the role of making sure it's usable and in some cases meets the requirements of the various vendors to actually be certified for their marketplace or be made available to be downloaded. The best tools often for testing and debugging mobile applications exist within the development environments. Xcode, for example, on iOS has great tools for profiling for memory leaks and for performance issues and for utilization of memory and battery, all types of things like that. So although these are tools that are primarily used by a developer, it's good to have someone on the development team using these things early on to make sure, because they'll detect a lot of the issues and be able to fix them quicker. For third-party tools, make sure you do research on the company who makes the app, right? Look at their reviews. Reviews aren't everything, but they do matter. How frequently are they doing updates? Is there support options? Can you contact the company? Is it an email or is it a phone system? Is it a reputable company who makes numerous products or just some guy out of his basement who wrote an app to make a few bucks, right? Not that there's anything wrong with the guy who wrote an app to make a few bucks, but you might have trouble getting him to fix things as quickly as a company who maybe, has multiple development staff or whatever and who has very much vested interest in making you happy.
Well, I do think that, one side effect or consequence of, kind of how simple it is to deploy apps out to mobile devices, especially through these app stores, is that they've kind of taken on this kind of aspect of being almost disposable, right? Like,
yes.
Well, I'll download it, I'll try it, if I don't like it, I'll get rid of it and move
Absolutely.
on to the next one. So, it's certainly a bit different than that kind of top-down model of pushing software.
Yeah, and the same thing can happen not only from the end-user perspective, but the developer. He could put an app out there, it might only get downloaded or make him a small amount of money or whatever. He can decide to abandon it, and all the emails in the world saying, oh, I'd like this feature change or this is bug. They could choose just to ignore it. So you have to know who it is you're getting applications from. And again, that's more if you're just taking applications that already exist in the marketplace and trying to adapt them for internal use.
So your advice would be, if you're planning to use it for business, make sure it's somebody who's doing it.
Absolutely. Who's doing it for business, yeah. Not some guy who threw an app together to make his life easier, and now he's sharing it trying to make a few bucks, right, when it may not be perfect for what you're looking for. Also, another important thing about knowing your application, make sure you understand what platforms and OSs you're going to be supporting, okay? And do these coincide with what the developers are doing for the application? So for Android, there's still a decent amount of 1X devices out there. I would not recommend writing apps for Android 1X at this point. It's, a dying OS. Most of the devices that have it still have it because they can't be upgraded and the people are just using old phones or whatever for testing or giving them to their kids or whatever to use on Wi-Fi. 2X, 3X, and 4X are the major versions of Android. 2.2 is where we here consider our starting point for our major application development. It represented a large step in the Google world as far as business support and features go. 2.1 also had some decent support in it, but 2.2 is when they really introduced some great new features from the business side to help control. iOS, you have 3X, 4X, and 5X, although 3X, again, is falling off. The good thing about iOS is usually within a couple months of the introduction of a new major OS, 2/3 of the user base is upgraded. So unlike Android, where you have a lot of that fragmentation and have to worry about that, for iOS, usually N-1, the current release, and the previous major release, are usually good enough to certify. Windows Phone 7, you had 7.0 and 7.5, which is Mango and then the original release. They will be releasing a new version called Tango in the near future. I believe in April it's coming out with some additional features. Know whether you're doing tablet or smartphones. Okay, does my application need to run on both? Does my application need to be optimized for a tablet? If you get a smartphone application and it's a smartphone application running on a tablet, users may not be as happy with the usability and the user interface because it's designed more for a smaller screen and it's scaled up. Having a UI that's designed to be on both a smartphone and a tablet helps to make the product more usable and likable by your end users. Okay. A couple more things. Are there any feature requirements? Does the application your test require anything such as GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, accelerometer, touchscreen? On Android, if you attempt to find an application in the market and that application in what they call its manifest that's built in with the application is marked as requiring a GPS, and the phone or device that the person is accessing the market with does not have a GPS, they won't even see that app. So you could have users calling you up and be like, you told me to search the marketplace for this great app, it's not showing up, and you're trying to figure out why, and it's because the developer marked that it required a GPS when really it didn't. So a good way on Android is when you go to install the application, either through the marketplace or through a web link, it'll actually tell you all the features it requires and what it requires access to. Don't ignore that list, because that tells you what exactly it wants to interact with on the phone and what features it wants, okay? So I've seen many times where people have a device and they can't find an application, and it's because the developer thought a certain feature was needed when actually it's optional, but marked it as required, now they can't see it in the marketplace, okay? And that's important to know from performance as well as functional perspectives. And then finally, are there any permission requirements? Does the app require access to your contacts, access to your phone history, access to your messaging, right? This is very important from a security perspective. If you're downloading an application that's just supposed to store web links and suddenly under the requirements section it's asking for permission to access your contact list, that should be raising a red flag with you, right? You should be able to explain why any permission on an app is required. It's required because it has this functionality and feature built in. Okay, so we'll take a brief break to start at another poll question here. And it's a simple question. We're looking, do you currently control which applications a user can install on their mobile device? So are you any policies in place that says what a user can install or not?
I get asked that question almost every single call I'm on with a prospect or a customer. They ask if you can either prevent apps from being installed or remove them. So it is a common, I think, kind of misconception of what's really possible on these platforms.
Yeah, that's one of the things we talked about, again, with the difference between smartphones and traditional laptop, desktop. There were applications, management applications, you could use to push down new apps or remove existing apps without a user even having control. It would come up and say, hey, this user has this sharing program installed, and you could say, just go uninstall it and remove it. With smartphones and tablets, it's a bit different. Generally, you can warn the user, notify and prompt them, but you have to require that they take some sort of action themselves. So it's important to understand that distinction.
Right. So the way we do it with MAS 360 is this. You can configure application blacklists and whitelists, and if a device goes out of compliance, meaning they install a blacklisted app or they install an app that's not in the whitelist, then MAS 360 will mark the device as out of compliance, and then IT can then take action on the device or work with the end user to rectify it.
Yep.
But the one thing that you can't do is just automatically uninstall the app.
Yep.
So kind of basically all you can really do is detect that someone's done something that's put the device out of compliance, put the device in the penalty box,
Yep.
and then keep it there until it's back in compliance.
Yep, correct. Okay, so it looks like from the results of that, about 3/4 currently aren't controlling. So that's an interesting statistic to note. So the next thing I want to talk about is some of the types of testing. So when you're testing an application, there's a list of various types of testing that you want to perform. Most of these do overlap with desktop, laptop type applications, but there's different approaches to them. The basic one is functional testing, right? It's the same basic rules. Is this app doing what it's supposed to do? If the app is supposed to help me, calculate interest or calculate the payment plans for one of my, employees in the field who's trying to sell cars or some other item to a customer, and it's miscalculating the interest rate or whatever, well, that's a major functional issue. So that's always one of the first and foremost things you want to check out for. One thing that is very big with mobile applications is usability and the user experience. Again, similar to traditional testing, but with additional caveats. You have to worry about with mobile applications, is it intuitive? Does the user understand how to use it? There are probably millions of people out there whose first real exposure to, a computer-like interface could be a smartphone. right? There are baby boomer generations and older who are getting smartphones who've never really done a lot of work on a traditional computer, so this is their first exposure to it. So they haven't used the mouse and the interface or been trained on Windows type applications in the past, so you want to make sure it's very intuitive. That's why you see, especially with Apple, very simple button clicks, click here does this, very simple, cohesive, fluent-looking UI. One of the things is that Apple specifically actually gives a requirements document for how the UI of the application has been presented. I've seen people whose applications have been rejected from Apple from showing up in the App Store because they use a tabbed display to switch between screens rather than using a tab bar, right? So Apple has UI recommendations you have to follow, and they will reject your app if they don't do it. If you think about it, when you look at iOS apps, they all pretty much have a very similar look and feel. The settings menus are always similar. The accessing from one screen to another, the transitions, the way the UI looks. And that existed to an extent in Windows and when you could do Windows applications, but there was a lot more flexibility there. So you got to make sure you don't overlook that. You can get an application, everything looks great, fine, and perfect, and then you submit it to Apple, and after waiting 2 to 3 weeks, they come back and say, And all their issues, they're not security issues, they're not functional issues, you can't have this icon on this side of the screen, or that label is longer than the width of the window. Really, what will be trivial stuff from a programming perspective are things that a tester would overlook, but that cause you to have to resubmit your app and wait another 2 to 3 weeks before it's available in the marketplace. Be aware of those things.
Hey, Frank, while you were talking about usability, a couple questions came in, so why don't we kind of hit one. Question is, in terms of usability, how much to worry about the network, is it enough to test live, or should you use a simulator?
Very good, and we actually are going to talk about that under performance in a second, so let me get over to that. That happens to be at the top of the next tab. Okay, performance, absolutely extremely important for mobile devices. Memory, CPU, and especially battery, and network utilization is a concern. Do not ever use a simulator to do performance testing. That's one of the top recommendations I can give you. Simulators emulate a straight network connection through your Ethernet. They don't simulate mobile traffic, so there's no mobile connection. There's no Bluetooth connection generally, although I've heard of ways to work around that. Generally, if you're doing performance, test on a real device. I do not believe a simulator is good enough for that. So you don't necessarily have to test on numerous devices for network traffic, but test on 1 or 2 so you know. So it's a very good question, very important. Performance, not only are memory and CPU good, but you also have to find ways to measure battery. And battery is very subjective. I have, at least on the Android platform, I have demoed at least a dozen different battery monitors from the marketplace, as well as the ones that are built into certain phones that come with the vendors or whatever, and I've never gotten the exact same answer from 2. So you really got to kind of come up with a way. You know what? In the end of it, as rudimentary as it sounds, taking 2 identical phones and sitting them next to each other, one with my app and one with and everything else the same, and seeing who lost more batteries over 4 hours is the most reliable battery testing I've found to do. It's not the most high tech. I'm sure there's better ways out there, but sometimes when you just quite frankly want to know, that's one of the easiest ways to do it. Okay? Time consuming, yes, but does it give you usable results that make sense to you? Absolutely. Okay? Upgrade testing. Do not negate the importance of testing upgrades of both your app and an OS upgrade. I'll give you an interesting story about an application I tested. When Google released the update from the 2.22x version of their operating system to 2.3x, there was an application that we were working with that after the upgrade locked up and stopped working. And what we discovered was we were using a Google library, or there was a Google library in use for encryption of the end-user sensitive data on device. And when Google upgraded to 2.3, they put a new version of that encryption engine in, and as part of that version, it fixed the bug that made the keys that were used to do the encryption in the old version incompatible. Right? So here's something, our app upgraded fine, we're looking at everything on our app, and in the end we find out it was something in the library. So we had to come up with an alternative way of decrypting the database during the upgrade so that we could re-encrypt it with the new keys. But don't just think upgrade to your OS. And just like applications, you never know who or when's going to release an upgrade, particularly to an Android. We all know when iOS is coming. It's well documented. Google releases an update today to the market, it could be 6 months from now, if at all, before certain vendors ever deploy the upgrade.
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying is not going to be comforting to testing people, right? Because what you just said was, besides worrying about what your own developers are doing to blow your apps out of the water,
correct,
the platform itself may change underneath you and blow your app out of the water.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen that often. That 2.2 to 2.3 example is really the best example I can give you when something like that happened, but you do have to be aware of it.
Right, so it happened once.
Yes, it's happened once in the time I've been testing, where a major upgrade has broken something, when an upgrade in the OS has broken my application directly. Okay. Then we have ease of installation. You want to make sure the install experience is clear and concise. Again, users don't always know how to do these upgrades. Use the App Store to distribute if you can, whether it be the vendor's App Store, like the Apple Store or the Google Marketplace, or a third-party App Store, such as what we offer with our MAS 360 platform. You can deploy a third-party App Store to deploy your enterprise apps. Notifications of upgrades. The user needs to be notified of upgrades. iOS and the Google Marketplace both do a decent job of notifying you of upgrades, but if you have a way internally to notify users through your own app store that you're deploying or through the application itself to say, hey, there's an update available, use it. Because then it can help to get them on the new, as I mentioned, there's new versions of the app traditionally come out faster than in the desktop world.
And in the MAS 360 App Store, we do send notifications.
Yes,
so
we do.
If an app that we've been pushing is updated, you'll get a notification.
Yep, the end users, any admins will get notifications, absolutely. And then our compatible OS device is clearly marked, right? In your app in the App Store, make sure it shows the supported platforms, particularly OS version. One of the good things about the Google Store is as long as you clearly mark when you elevate your app which platforms it's compatible with, then people who aren't on those platforms won't even see that app available, right? And you can do similar functionality in enterprise app stores as well to target them to specific people, the groups of people who only meet the criteria. You don't want someone trying to install an app that doesn't work on their device and having it fail and then getting calls and wondering what's going on with this, okay? A couple last things, accessibility. This is important to some people. Most of these mobile devices have functionality built in for people with disabilities that you can see and use with. Does your app need to utilize that in any way? Credibility, very important. If you're presenting invalid data or there's clearly a mistake in your calculations or your functionality, it can affect the credibility of your company and impact people, especially if you're selling apps to other companies. So if you're in a habit of selling your apps to other companies, not just using them internally, you want to make sure you don't do anything that could be credible. There's also what we call user emotions, which is kind of a new thing. You don't want to bug the user, right? There's a fine line here. Users using mobile applications don't like stuff popping up in front of them constantly unless it's important. So be careful of how much you interact with the user. Another brief thing would be security testing. It's not pointing out specifically here, but make sure you understand if there's any security impacts of your application. What I mean by that is if you remember back when I talked about the requirements, does your application access the contacts information? Does it access the phone system? Does it access email data? Any type of thing it's accessing on the phone, make sure you have an explanation for why that's needed. And if it's functionality you don't need, take it out. Like sometimes SMS. If you want your application to be able to read SMS messages to help out with something, that's good, but a lot of people frown upon that. So if it's not functionality you really need, don't use it. Okay? So we're going to move on now to talking about some tools that can help you in mobile application testing. The first one is emulators. So all major platforms have emulators available. Usually the emulators are available within the development environment themselves. So for Apple, it's within Xcode. For Android, for Google, it's within the Android SDK that you download. They're good for basic app testing, functional, user experience. You can generally interact with your mouse to simulate most of the clicking and swiping that a user would do, so they're very good for that. They're not good for performance, resource, or sensor testing. I've heard a couple times people where they've gone into an iOS and say, I run it in the emulator and that thing flies, and then I install it on an iPhone 3GS and the thing crawls. Well, yeah. On your PC, the emulator is going to suck up as much resources as you have. Xcode, when you run the emulator, is a resource hog. If you have 8 gigs of memory, it'll suck up as much of it as it can, to the point where you can't run other stuff on a PC at the same time. So it's going to try and use that 6 to 8 gigs of memory on your PC, when on the phone itself, it's got 512 megs of RAM. So don't use your, how well it performs on an emulator to have any indication whatsoever on how it's going to perform on a physical device. Okay? And again, you can't really use them for performance, resource, or sensor testing. So you could simulate some sensors like the gyroscope on an emulator, but really you want the true device there to flip it around and see how it works. If you want to test traffic over the actual cellular network rather than Wi-Fi, well, then you need a real device. If you want to test true Bluetooth interactability, you need it on a real device, okay? So more for basic functional testing, UI, user experience, you can use the emulators for. And then I already talked about the apps for performance testing. For first-party iOS, Xcode is pretty much, the one that we've used and done any type of work with here. It's great for doing performance, looking for performance issues with your apps before you build it. It's great for functional testing. It's a fully compiled emulator. For third-party, there's not only the Android emulator that you can use for limited functional testing, not so much for performance, but there are numerous applications in the App Store for Android to help out specifically with performance testing. I've listed a few of my favorites here. Some people may have their own favorites they like, but I've used System Profiler. It's very cheap, helps you to check the usage of your CPU and memory over time of your application, as well as limited battery. Battery Mix is a great application for tracking what applications are sucking up the battery and how much are they using. And then there's various task managers that can report on CPU testing and all as well. So Android, you do have that benefit of a lot of third-party apps, that help with performance testing. Okay. Another tool available when you need access to a physical device is what we call virtual device testing. There are companies out there that have subscription-based services where you actually access real devices. So I put the names of two here, Device Anywhere and Perfecto Mobile. Device Anywhere we actually use here regularly. It's our current app that we're using. Basically what these companies do is they take hundreds of real devices. They buy their real phones and they take them and they install them into some sort of, automated system or wherever where you access it either through the web or through an application over the web, and they allow you to really interact with the real device. So you're seeing a picture of the actual phone, and you're actually clicking on the different buttons and doing screen swipes and installing applications and uninstalling. The apps are connected over the cellular and Wi-Fi networks. You could turn the camera on the phone and actually see a picture of the lab where they're at and turn the flash on and off. So it's really as close as you can get to a real device without actually having one in your hand.
So folks were asking, a question came in about, is there a way to get access to older devices like Android
This is your thing.
other than eBay, right?
Yes. This is one of the ways you can do it, yeah. Generally, these vendors don't always apply the upgrades as quickly as other ones. Now, there are some side effects of using these. Are shared devices, right? So if the last guy went in there and totally screwed with the device, it could get in a hung broken state, and then you have to report it and wait for them to fix it and reset it again. It happens. Shared devices, maybe the device you need is not available. They only have one of them. But we use this a lot when we test Windows 6 mobile devices. We've used it for BlackBerries. Basically, all the major platforms are represented. And you're actually accessing a real device. So in the end, other than the latency of the screen display, and I find you could set the resolution and the color scale down a little bit and get a very responsive experience with the device. To say, hey, the device works and it's doing the functionality.
So I guess what you're saying is you've kind of stressed along the way here that it's very important to do what you can do kind of in the emulators, but you're not really doing a full test or a valid test unless you've tested on actual physical devices. Right. And the good news is there's two ways to do that. There's this virtual way through these virtual device testing services, and there's the old-fashioned way, which is go buy the device. Yeah, and really the ideal scenario is a combination of both, right? You should always have some real devices, but obviously you don't want to go out and buy every Android phone. A customer says, hey, I just tried to install your app on the new, the new Motorola Razr Pro or whatever that came out. And you're like, oh, well, I don't have one of those right now, and it looks like a simple issue. Let me look, hey, look, this company online, that I subscribe to has it. Let me go use it and do the testing real quick. So this is a great way to get access to some of those older devices. I find these vendors don't update the OSs with every little update that came out, but you can't guarantee that. You have to go in and see what they have, but you're always going to find some device that has the old 2.2 or 2.1 Android OS because it hasn't been upgraded by the vendor yet. Right. And they have hundreds of the phones, so there's always something available. So, and there are other companies like it. These are just two of the ones that I personally have experience with evaluation or using that I can recommend to take a look at. Okay. New devices get added regularly. Now, the day a new device comes out, you're not going to see it on these sites. It might be a couple of weeks or a month or two, but they get there. And it can save you money. Remember, they're subscription-based. Generally, you pay for a certain block of hours. Again, I don't have the exact prices on me, but you'll pay for a certain block of hours, and then I think overages for at least one of the services is like $15 an hour.
So depending on how much you're going to use, you have to weigh the cost of this versus the cost of acquiring. If there's a certain device that you know you're going to be testing constantly on, it's still probably cheaper to buy it. But at least here, these guys have incurred the cost of having contracts with all these. So these devices are all on the various networks. They separate by vendor, by provider. So you could say, I need the HTC Nexus one on the T-Mobile network. Yep, there it is. They got it.
Okay.
Great. I need the Droid Razor on the Verizon network. Yep, they got it. I need the O2 UK version, Vodafone version of this device. And there's a good chance they have it because they have US, Europe, and generally some Asia split up as well. So you get access to hundreds of devices. Not everything, but a very large number of them. Okay. I'll talk briefly a bit about automation. It's still in its infancy. There's not a large selection of options for automation right now, unfortunately. The same things that limit what we can do to a device as far as installing applications and all those same types of security measures that are in place on the devices make automation hard. There are various options, but a lot of them are platform specific, right? So there are some tools and all for aiding and automating iOS testing. There are some tools available for automating Android testing. I've evaluated and looked at them. None of them are quite meeting our needs yet, which is why we haven't dropped in and actually grabbed one. There are some newer companies out there that are using some cross-platform, highly integrated automation testing. I recently evaluated one where you actually write your automated scripts in real Java code. And they wrote an engine where you actually install something on the device that executes the app. Unfortunately, to get the level of control that I need against the phone, I was having to create custom ROMs and root the devices in order to do the testing. And the moment I do that, I'm no longer testing on real devices. I'm testing on highly modified devices. So it kind of defeated the purpose. So be aware also that the virtual device companies offer automation, but they usually require you purchase dedicated devices on their platform, which in the end will run you more than buying the device yourselves, and it's extremely costly. So again, we've looked into it. There are options available if you want to go that route. That are there, it's just more costly because usually you have to have dedicated devices, right, that only you control. You don't want another company in there installing their application to test on the phone, and then when you go to use it for automation, you got to spend an hour first getting it back to a pristine state ready for your testing. So a lot of the automation options today are screen scrapers. So if you need simple interaction with your application or whatever to click buttons, verify it does stuff, there are ones out there that can do it. I could do a whole presentation on what I've learned of automation testing. But like I said, I still think it has some room to go. This is definitely a market where third-party companies, if they can find a way to get beyond some of these challenges, could really, get something going. The final thing I want to mention, because it's interesting, because we've tried it with mixed results, is community testing, or what's sometimes called crowd testing. There are multiple people that offer this online. If you search for crowd testing, you're seeing it. Basically what it is these companies, oftentimes little startups or small little groups that guys get together, will get a bunch of people they know who are maybe in the computer field or who are tech heads or whatever, and they'll get them to send in, hey, I have a Droid Razor. Oh, I have this phone. Oh, I have this phone. And what you're essentially doing is submitting your app with a simple set of directions to this company, and they find one of their users who have the devices you want, and they send them directions, and they test your app for you. So it's an interesting concept in that it's generally cheaper than using dedicated devices that you buy or for doing other things. So if you just want to get user experience on a wide variety of phones, you might go to one of these companies and say, hey, if you have these 20 model phones, I just need users to go install the app, click here, here, and here, and tell me what it says, and then they're done. Right? So crowd testing is an interesting concept. Again, it's been around, I think, for a while, something newer in the mobile testing world that's going on, but that's another option you have too if you don't mind your application kind of getting out there to a bunch of people who necessarily you won't get to meet or talk to directly. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, unless we have any questions, Joe, on any of that?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, we're going to move on to just some helpful hints or things to remember. This is based on stuff that I've seen in the testing I've been doing in mobile applications for the last couple of years. The first thing is if you're developing an in-house app, start testing early while development's still going on. Get those early builds. Ask the developer to run the resource tools and enhancers and debug tools available to make sure they catch any major things early on. Okay, rather than completing the whole app, giving it to you and moving on to another project, and then you find a bunch of things that need to be changed. Know your target platform and devices, especially if you're doing Android. Make sure you know up front what versions and platforms you want to support. Especially, again, with Android, even so with iOS, don't assume that because it works on one device, it works on all. Okay? Just because it works on a Motorola Zoom tablet doesn't mean it's going to work on an Asus Transformer tablet, right? Should, but may not. Don't underestimate the importance of performance testing. Again, I talked about the law of end-user battery usage. You made me install this app, and now it's killing my battery, right? If only, I often want to do like if I was in college doing a thesis or something, I would do like a placebo study where I take, 20 people and install the real app and 20 people and install nothing but an app that does nothing, but with the same name. And I bet you the same number of people in both groups will complain that the battery was getting eaten up by the app.
Yeah.
It's just, it's perception. People want to blame your app for whatever issues they're having with their device.
Well, it's always the last thing installed is the root cause.
Is the root cause, yeah.
Now, one thing, Frank, maybe you could talk to for a moment. I mean, I know you go to great lengths. We do this in the laptop world, and I know we also do it in the smartphone and tablet world to, measure things like boot up time, measure things like battery consumption, and actually, document it, and kind of we know what it is for our releases. Correct?
Yes. Yeah, we do try to do that. You should always have that stuff on hand of what you've done, at least for a couple different devices, so that you have a place to start with. I mean, we've seen instances before where, like on a particular phone, say a certain HTC device, a customer will report an issue, and we're able to replicate on that device. We have one where a customer, where the battery was being eaten by our app, and then the vendor released an update a week later, and one of their fixes was address some issues with battery concern, and suddenly the battery issues went away with our app. So there could be legitimate issues. Don't assume that the user's crazy, but just weigh it with a grain of salt. Okay. Always have some physical devices around, especially old ones. If you're going to write an iOS app, make sure you test it on an iOS 3GS. There are significant differences in hardware and feature set between a 3GS and a 4 or 4S, okay? So when your employees are upgrading their phones, don't trash those old 3GSs. Don't sell them to some guy on Craigslist or eBay. Hey, buy them and save them. Have a couple around. You don't need contracts on them. Just have them connected via Wi-Fi.
So we would typically test them via Wi-Fi, right?
Yes, you would use Wi-Fi to do most of your testing, right? I mean, when you're doing network functional testing, yeah, you can do that on a new one, but generally there's not too much of a difference there. But keep some of those old devices. Don't throw them out or sell them, or if you're going to give them to your kids, make sure you can borrow them again when you need to do it. Okay? And always try and have a group of beta testers to help with real-world testing, right?
I think that's a big best practice for us.
Absolutely.
Right? We've always got people beta testing.
Yeah, we internally will roll out to a small group and say, before you post it to market, roll it out through your enterprise store. If you have an enterprise app store, a way to distribute the apps, or even via Dropbox link or something for Android, post it, hey guys, go here and upgrade your application. Let me know how it goes over the next few days, or try it out,
So I think we learned that, no matter how much you as a testing organization try to think through every last, kind of dimension of a test matrix, it's impossible to get it all, and that to some degree, the sooner you can get it into people's hands and, let the, variations that you'll find out there when multiple people are testing get you to the end quicker.
Absolutely. One of the good things about smartphones, particularly iOS, is you don't have to worry as much about the old interoperability between softwares. With iOS, there's only ever one application running at a time. So if your application is running out of memory or something, it's because you're wasting the memory, not because the user has other stuff running. Now, Android is a little more complicated because you can have multitasking and all. But still, haven't seen as much to the level of where you see, this other third-party app is directly breaking my application. It may be interfering because they're both trying to control the same thing or do the same thing, but the likelihood of it directly breaking your application is less in the mobile world, especially on iOS. Okay. Don't underestimate or overestimate the importance of anecdotal test results. So when those beta testers come back and say, there's a weird thing that happened. My phone rebooted out of nowhere later that night after I installed the new version of our app. Yeah, well, if you know Android devices, they have a habit of doing that occasionally. Probably could just be bad timing that night his phone decided to reboot, right? Something else crashed. So if he says it's happened 5 times since he installed it, okay. Same thing with performance. People say it's eating away at my battery. Well, okay, how much is it eating away? Well, I had to recharge it last night. Well, how often do you normally have to charge it? Oh, I usually charge it in the morning. Did you have any long calls yesterday? Oh, yeah, I was on that sales call for 4 hours. Well, using the phone feature drains your battery much quicker than normal, okay? Know the target audience for your application. Make sure you know if these are technical people or people who, have been forced into using smartphones in their daily usage. And as I mentioned earlier, be aware of upgrades to your application as well as upgrades to the device's OS. Either could break your app. Okay? So that pretty much wraps up what I had to cover here. Before we go into questions, I think we want to do one final poll question, which is which mobile applications do you primarily plan to test applications for?
So while you're responding to that, we're going to do a little bit of housework, housekeeping, and then we'll turn things over to you, and you can send us questions via Q&A or chat. One thing I wanted to mention, obviously the big event in the mobility world this week, no, it's not the upcoming new version of the iPad. It's the Mobile World Congress, which is going on in Barcelona right now. And I guess it was on Tuesday, 2 days ago, we were very happy to be selected as the best enterprise mobile service at the show. So it's kind of the biggest global wireless trade show. And MAZ360 kind of was selected over a number of our competitors. So we were very happy about that. And, hopefully you folks who are either customers of ours or who have evaluated MAZ360 kind of feel the same way about the product. So I wanted to make sure you all knew about that. Again, John's going to send out a link here that will let you tweet about today's webinar very quickly. So if you're inclined, please click on that. And one last bit of wrap up here, and then we're going to go over to Q&A. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a webinar on enabling iPads in the enterprise. And you can be certain that we'll be covering anything new in the iPad world that should happen between now and then. So we all know that something big is brewing, and by March 15th, we'll all know what it is. So join us then if you want to learn more about how to enable iPads in the enterprise. We're doing our next Getting Started webinar on March 20th, so that's for anyone who's evaluating MAZ360. Val Hetrick, who's the director of our customer engineering team, hosts that webinar, and she is there to show people how to get the most out of their eval, answer any questions they're having. As always, all of our past webinars, and I think this was webinar, 49 or 50, John?
49.
Number 49. So all of our 48 previous webinars are recorded, as this one will be. Feel free to go to the Master Center and find those. John will push out a link where you can get to those recorded webinars. The Master Center's also got lots of other great how-to content about all things mobility, whether you want to know how to use Swipe on an iOS device, or whether you want to know how to track mobile data usage using MAZ360. You can find kind of all kinds of questions about it. One other thing I wanted to mention to folks, if you're interested, FiberLink's very involved in the Software and Information Industry Association, so sometimes you hear it called SIIA. They're having a webinar on learning all about the cloud. And if you're interested, we'd certainly encourage you to go check that webinar out and possibly sign up for it. So it's a great organization doing a lot of work to promote cloud. Obviously, that's what we're all about. We're all in on the cloud, so we would certainly encourage you to learn all you can about it. The link to that is there, and maybe John could push that out via chat. I'm going to put him on the spot a little bit, see how he does. So that's it for the housekeeping. So what I'm going to do is start going through the questions. We'll get to as many as we can. It looks like we've got about 10 minutes here, Frank, so let's jump right in, okay? All right, so question. There we go, I'll get to one here. How much specific device testing needs to be done for mobile-friendly web apps versus native apps?
That's a good question. So with mobile-friendly apps, web apps as we call it, those are ones that are generally cross-platform. It really depends more generally on the browser that you're going to be acting with. There is a difference between Android and iOS as far as to what level the different versions support HTML5. So if you're using HTML5, which is what's still kind of being developed or added to as far as developing web apps, you got to be careful because a lot of the older devices have older browsers which support very few, if any, of the HTML extensions. So I would say not as much as native apps, but you should try and test them in as many different browsers as you can. So you may have 3 HTC phones all running the same version of HTC's web browser. Any one of them will be fine. But if you're testing an older version of the HTC OS that has an older version of the web browser, you could run into issues.
Well, Frank, here's kind of an opinion question. And the question is this: who do you believe is responsible for mobile testing? Is it a dedicated mobile team, development, QA, and where do you think it's going?
Very good question. I think it's a hybrid approach. We find that with mobile testing specifically, having development do all the work and then hand over the app to the QA team to do does not work very well. You want the QA team involved early on. We have our QA teams here involved during the design and implementation phase. Our QA team is one of the three solid voices: the product team, design team, the developers, and then QA are the three voices that get heard for discussing any new features. Keep in mind that the developers often, are used to just working in the world of the emulator and all, so they won't know about the nuances and all which come with testing certain phones. The developer might say, yeah, I'm going to make them, they'll click this button to do this, and then the guy might say, hey, you do realize that half the phones these days no longer have a recent apps button or a menu button, so we should put that in the UI somewhere. So I think it's a hybrid approach. Having like a specific dedicated team, that really depends on internally. Are you building a new team just to test mobile application design, or is it the same team who developed desktop apps in the past, But I would say you want to, the key is to have the QA guys involved early on with the early design, seeing the screenshots, how it's going to look, knowing how it's going to operate then, and again, getting early builds, even if features are incomplete. If it can install, they can test something. So that, I think, is more of the key, and it being like a hybrid approach of having both teams work together. And unit testing is extremely important. Any QA guy will tell you the developers have to test their own code. As developers, they have access to tools and whatnot that can make testing a lot easier than the QA guy getting it later, depending on how your QA team's set up.
And we also found that you had to get the devices out into the field.
Absolutely.
We learned that way back when,
yes,
when we were doing, Wi-Fi and cellular remote access and unified communications, right? You've got to get these devices out in the field and test that way. Otherwise, you just don't know how your app's going to perform.
Absolutely.
Another question that came in was how much specific device testing needs to be done. We just covered that one. So the question was, are the virtual devices okay for performance, resource, and sensor testing?
For some of it, yes. So for sensor testing, you can generally interact with them in some way through the interfaces. They'll give you the ability to flip it sideways, flip it in portrait mode, landscape, to simulate like shaking and all. It depends on the vendor. You want to check and see what interaction they have. Interacting with keyboard, screen swiping, all that stuff is standard. As far as sensor testing, if you want to test a mobile network, yes, absolutely. Bluetooth, sure, but if you need to connect to a device that's with you, there's no real way to connect over the web, to access Bluetooth. So for some sensor testing, yes. Performance testing, the trick there is that these devices are permanently plugged in, so for battery testing, no.
Okay.
You might be able to set up something with them for dedicated devices and ask them to plug and unplug them as you need it, but now you're getting into specific deals with the vendor. So for batteries, no. The problem with CPU and memory is, at least in the ones that we've evaluated, while you have the device open on the screen, you are paying. So you're paying that $15 to $20 an hour to have it on your screen. The moment you close the device on your screen, it releases it back to the wild and runs whatever cleanup scripts they have, which can wipe out your app and give someone else access to the phone, which interferes with your performance testing. So if you're trying to do performance testing that takes a long time and you need to measure it over a long period, not so good for that from a cost perspective. And and if the device suddenly locks up on you or you lose access to it, there goes your 3 hours. So generally, for most performance testing, I recommend real physical devices. Okay. For some sensor-type testing and brief performance testing, like what's my average CPU when I'm executing this action, sure, install the performance app on a device through the, you can install any apps you want on these devices through these vendors and then do the test that way.
Mm-hmm. Another question, how do you install in-house apps on the virtual devices?
Very, very good question. There are a few different ways to do it. I've done mostly with Android, but for Android, you can post them to a Dropbox link or to any type of web link you have and get it on there that way. For Android and iOS devices, the vendor provides an interface where you can send the device directly on the app. They've modified the device so that they'll be able to run your app right on it and do the testing. So that's pretty much included as part of the service on the application. Most of the time when I do Android, I just download it from like a Dropbox URL, because just about all Android devices these days will allow you to turn on the unknown sources feature. I have tried to directly send to a device, and I believe iOS has a similar functionality of directly sending your app to the device. Okay.
All right, here's a good question. How do you test apps for 2G, 3G, and 4G networks in a QA environment?
That's an excellent question as well. That can be tough. So you can use the systems that I mentioned, the Device Anywhere Perfecto Mobile. They'll have devices that support the different ones, 2G, 3G, 4G. For 2G, 4G, some of your older devices, and even your newer ones for 3G, 4G, will generally have an option right in them that says use only 4G networks, use only 3G networks. Now, the biggest problem is you want to test a 4G app, and the nearest 4G signal from where you're at is 20 miles away in the next major city. Not much you can do there. You can look on these device sites to see, but keep in mind that these devices are generally in test labs, in server rooms, so what's the likelihood that a good 4G signal is getting in there? So yeah, at some point you're probably either driving to find a good signal like for 4G, or remember I mentioned the anecdotal testing or the beta group, giving it to some people and saying, hey, can you go try this out and see what it does?
And that's why we're big believers in field testing.
Yes, it does. Yeah, we're in an area here just outside of Philly, but I have to walk around our parking lot to get a decent 4G signal half the time, And that's just the nature of the 4G technology because they're still expanding their range and all. Sooner or later they're going to put a tower up down the road, and I'm going to be the first one to applaud the guys who are setting it up, But yeah, that is something you have to be worried of. You can use the online resources to do some of that, but again, using beta testers or trying yourself to use the settings in the phone to restrict it, you can do that as well.
So there's a question about is the resource proportion between development and QA different for mobile projects than traditional software? So I think the metric for traditional software is typically 1 tester per 2 developers. I guess the question is it much different from the mobile world?
In my experience, oftentimes because of it depends on how many platforms and all you're going to certify for and how many different devices. With iOS, I would say that's probably a good ratio, but for Android, because of the amount of different versions of the OS and all, I would almost flip it. I would say 2 testers per developer.
Okay.
And that's with Android Agent at least, where I focus a lot of my time on. I find that I've needed to have 2 QA persons per full-time developer working on it because we have to certify 2.2, 2.3, 3.0, 4X, HTC, Samsung, Kindle Fire, an Android device, now that runs a version of Android. So I find, at least for that, for iOS, with these mobile applications, there's so many different aspects you want to test of connectivity and how it impacts and different functionality that unless you have a lot of dedicated time for your developers to do unit testing, you do need a high level of QA, and in my experience, more QA than developers in some cases.
Okay, fantastic. Well, folks, we're just about up against our hour here. If there's 1 or 2 more questions you want to send in, send them in, and we'll try to cover them here in the moment or 2 we've got left. So one just came in. You mentioned performance profiling for mobile apps by the QA teams. What practices do you focus on in terms of profiling? So I guess it would be battery.
Oh,
CPU.
yes, for performance testing, yeah. Our 3 main groupings are CPU, memory, and battery. Battery being by far the greatest, I would say, followed by CPU, and then memory as a 3rd one. Generally, if you have memory issues, they will manifest itself during normal testing of the application. But battery, spend a lot of time on just because it's a sensitive topic for the field generally, for customers and all wanting to know. And then CPU to a lesser extent, most applications, as long as your application is running when it's in the foreground and doing what it needs to do, then you're fine. If you're writing applications that run in the background, which is really more of an Android thing and a Microsoft thing, iOS, there's not so much of a concept as background apps. There are ways to do things in the background, but not to the same extent as Android, and also you don't have to worry about it as much there. You just have to worry about there being resources available for your app and that you're not leaking memory internally because it'll cause your app to crash, right? There are some very specific things on iOS where if you start leaking memory, after a while, iOS will come back to your app and say, hey, you're using too much memory. And if it doesn't fix itself within a few seconds or a few minutes, it will forcibly close your app and say, that's it, you've gotten your warning, you're gone. So, you need to handle those types of things. And again, there are developer tools that help the developers find those memory leaks before it gets to you. Okay, so
there's been a couple questions, I guess, specifically about security testing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, there's certainly some best practices. I mean, the platforms themselves kind of, are more or less the gatekeepers, right, of security, right?
Yeah.
So, it's much harder to write a kind of a antisocial app than in mobile devices than it was in kind of the Wintel world. Any kind of other than kind of best practices like make users authenticate, things like that.
Yeah, so security perspective as far as like if you want to protect a device from other applications getting sensitive data and all, like I said, try to control to the extent you can what applications your user can install. If you have a security system installed like Manage 360 that can monitor and tell you what applications are on their users, or if you want to actually control and say don't allow these apps to be installed or allow these apps to be installed, require various ones to be there. Malware detection on some of these OSs is still kind of, something that's not so easily found. There are some third-party applications out there that can look for things like that, but Android seems to be, the one getting all the attention on that because of their less strict market, criteria for evaluating apps before they get into there. Just keeping up to speed and being aware and knowing what your users are doing within your application itself or an application you're supporting. I mentioned know what the application is interacting with. On Android, look at what resources and privileges it wants and make sure you understand why each one is required. And if there's something you don't like, follow up with the vendor and ask them why, or follow up with your developers and say, hey, why do we need access to SMS messages? What are we doing that does that, right? Obviously, you're not generally concerned that an in-house developed app is going to be a security concern. You're more concerned with outside applications. So research is your best friend in those regards. Okay,
that's good advice. Well, folks, we're up against our hour. Thanks for joining us. Frank, thank you for all the great information. This is a webinar we'd wanted to do for a while, and we got a lot of feedback for our webinar program for 2012, asking for more technical webinars, so this was certainly a response to that. Folks, we'll have the recorded version of this posted tomorrow at the URL you'll get via email in a moment. And hope we can see you again in 2 weeks where we'll be filling you in on anything new regarding the iPad. Obviously, there's something new happening next week. So hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks. Bye-bye.